The first-class encounter. It was a clear morning when Brian Carter, a 42-year-old self-proclaimed business tycoon, strutted into the airport with the confidence of a man who believed the world revolved around him. His tailored suit, gold wristwatch, and leather briefcase screamed wealth and power. First class was his domain, a space where he could flaunt his success without the distractions of the ordinary people in economy. As he approached the gate, Brian took a moment to survey the other first-class passengers. To him, they were competitors in a silent battle of status. He smirked as he mentally ranked himself above most of them. But one man caught his attention, a quiet figure sitting alone, dressed in a plain black hoodie and worn-out jeans. The man had no flashy accessories, no designer luggage, and no air of importance. Brian frowned. What is this guy doing in first class? Did someone make a mistake? When boarding began, Brian made sure to be among the first to enter. As he settled into his spacious seat, he was relieved to see that the quiet man wasn't in his row. Instead, the man took a seat across the aisle, calmly putting away his small backpack. Brian couldn't help but scoff. Looks like economy overflowed into first class today, he muttered to the flight attendant as she walked by. She gave him a polite but strained smile, clearly uncomfortable with his comment. Once the passengers were seated and the plane began to taxi, Brian leaned back and pulled out his laptop. He had barely started typing when the man across the aisle caught his eye again. He was flipping through a small notebook, scribbling something with a pen. The simplicity of it irritated Brian. Who even uses notebooks anymore, he said loudly, pretending to speak to himself but clearly aiming the remark at the man. The stranger glanced up, meeting Brian's gaze for a brief moment. His face was calm, his eyes kind but tired. I do, he replied softly before returning to his writing. Brian huffed. Is this guy for real? As the flight took off, Brian made no effort to hide his disdain. He complained loudly about the coffee, the seatbelt, and even the in-flight magazine, all while sneaking glances at the man. The stranger remained unfazed, occasionally smiling at the flight attendants or exchanging quiet words with the elderly woman sitting next to him. About an hour into the flight, the stranger got up to stretch his legs. When he was out of earshot, Brian leaned toward the elderly woman. I can't believe they let just anyone into first class these days, he said with a chuckle. The woman turned to him with a sharp look. That man has been nothing but kind and polite since we boarded. Maybe you should try it. Brian raised an eyebrow, taken aback by her boldness. I'm just saying, first class used to have standards, he muttered, leaning back in his seat. The elderly woman sighed and shook her head. Standards, indeed, she said under her breath, turning her attention back to her book. When the stranger returned to his seat, Brian couldn't resist making another jab. So, what do you do? He asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess, freelance writer. The man smiled politely. Something like that, he replied. Brian smirked. Exactly what I thought. As the flight continued, Brian grew restless. He started boasting loudly about his business ventures, dropping names of companies and celebrities he claimed to have worked with. A few passengers rolled their eyes, but Brian didn't notice, or didn't care. The stranger, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He spent most of the flight reading, writing, or occasionally chatting with the flight attendants. One of the attendants even stopped by his seat with a cup of tea, which she handed to him with a smile. Brian couldn't help but notice. You seem pretty cozy with the staff, he remarked. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. They're kind people, he said simply. Brian snorted. Sure. Kindness gets you far in this world, he said sarcastically, shaking his head. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the young girl sitting a few rows ahead, who was staring at him with wide eyes. She whispered something to her mother, who smiled and nodded. Moments later, the girl approached the man, clutching a small notebook. Excuse me, she said shyly. Are you Keanu Reeves? Brian froze. The man smiled warmly at the girl. I am, he said. What's your name? The girl introduced herself, her face lighting up with excitement. I love your movies, she said. You're my dad's favorite actor. Keanu chuckled. Thank you. That means a lot. He signed her notebook and even posed for a quick photo, which the girl's mother took with a trembling hand. As the girl returned to her seat, Brian stared at Keanu in disbelief. Keanu Reeves? No way. He quickly pulled out his phone and searched for photos of the actor. The more he compared them, the more obvious it became. It was him. The man he had been mocking for hours was one of the most beloved actors in the world, a man known for his humility, generosity, and kindness. The mockery escalates. Brian sat in stunned silence as the realization of who he had been mocking slowly sank in. His initial shock quickly turned into denial. No, it couldn't be him. Keanu Reeves. Here. On this flight. Dressed like that. Brian shook his head, brushing off the thought. It had to be a mistake. Surely, a global superstar like Keanu Reeves wouldn't be flying first class, let alone wearing clothes that looked like they came from a discount store. But the evidence was mounting. The way the young girl had lit up at the sight of him, her mother's trembling hands, the way the flight attendants treated him with extra care, it all started to make sense. Brian's disbelief gave way to irritation. What kind of celebrity flies first class and doesn't flaunt it? He muttered under his breath. He wasn't about to let this go. If this man really was Keanu Reeves, Brian needed to test him. Leaning slightly into the aisle, Brian cleared his throat loudly. Hey, buddy, he said with a forced grin. So, what's it like being a big movie star? Keanu looked up from his notebook, his expression calm and unbothered. I don't know about being a big movie star, he said humbly, but I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had. Brian smirked. Come on, don't be modest. You're Keanu Reeves, right? The Matrix guy. John Wick? That's you, isn't it? Keanu nodded politely. Yes, that's me. Brian leaned back in his seat, letting out a loud laugh. Wow. And here I thought celebrities only flew in private jets. What happened? Business not doing so well. A few passengers turned to look, their faces a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Keanu, however, didn't rise to the bait. He simply smiled and said, I like flying with people. It's grounding. Brian rolled his eyes. Grounding, huh? That's a new one. I guess saving money on private flights is your way of staying humble. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. A middle-aged man sitting a few rows back cleared his throat loudly, as if to signal his discomfort, but Brian ignored it. He was on a roll now, and he wasn't about to stop. So, Brian continued, if you're such a big star, why aren't you dressed like one? No designer suits. No entourage. You're not even wearing a watch. Keanu looked at him, his expression unchanged. I don't think those things are necessary, he said simply. Brian smirked again, shaking his head. Unbelievable. You've got people worshipping you, thinking you're some kind of saint, and this is how you show up. No wonder Hollywood's a mess. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. Young man, she said, her voice firm, don't you think you've said enough? Brian turned to her, surprised by her interruption. Excuse me? You've been mocking this gentleman since the flight began, she said, her tone sharp. And for what? Because he's not what you expected him to be? You should be ashamed of yourself. Brian opened his mouth to respond, but the woman wasn't finished. I've lived long enough to know that the loudest voices often have the least to say. And right now, you're proving me right. A few passengers nodded in agreement. Brian, caught off guard, laughed awkwardly. "Look, lady, I was just making conversation. No need to get so worked up." The woman narrowed her eyes. "There's a difference between conversation and cruelty. Maybe you should learn it." Keanu gave the woman a grateful nod but said nothing. He remained calm, almost as if he were immune to Brian's insults. This only fueled Brian's frustration. Determined to regain control of the situation, Brian turned back to Keanu. "Okay, fine. Let's forget about all that. Tell me, what's the deal with you? Everyone says you're this amazing guy, but how much of that is just Hollywood PR? You can't be as humble as people say." Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think it's about being amazing," he said quietly. "It's about trying to do the right thing when you can." Brian snorted. "That's it? That's your big philosophy? Do the right thing? Sounds pretty basic to me." Keanu shrugged. "Sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to do." The cabin fell silent for a moment. Even Brian didn't know how to respond to that. It was as if Keanu's words had deflected his insults, leaving him with nothing to grasp onto. As the flight attendants began serving lunch, the mood in the cabin shifted. Passengers whispered among themselves, some stealing glances at Keanu. It was clear that more people were recognizing him now. A young couple seated nearby leaned over and asked for a photo, which Keanu graciously agreed to. Brian watched the exchange, his irritation growing. How could someone so plain, so unassuming, command so much admiration? It didn't make sense to him. When the flight attendant reached Brian's row, he leaned over and whispered, "Hey, is that really Keanu Reeves?" The attendant smiled and nodded. "Yes, it is. He's a regular on this route. Always so kind and down-to-earth." Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't know why, but the idea of Keanu being universally adored grated on his nerves. He wanted to find a flaw, something that would prove the man wasn't as perfect as everyone believed. But no matter how hard he tried, Keanu gave him nothing. No anger, no arrogance, just patience and quiet humility. It was infuriating. By the time the meal service ended, Brian was out of insults. He sat back in his seat, stewing in his own frustration. Across the aisle, Keanu had returned to his notebook, writing something with a peaceful expression on his face. The elderly woman leaned over and whispered to Brian, "You might want to think about why this bothers you so much. It says more about you than it does about him." Brian didn't respond. For the first time that day, he had nothing to say. The passengers whispered warnings. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was still heavy from the tension Brian had stirred. Although some passengers had returned to their in-flight movies or books, an unspoken current of disapproval lingered in the air. Meanwhile, Brian remained restless, his mind grappling with the idea that the quiet man across the aisle was, in fact, Keanu Reeves. Brian hated feeling out of control, and for the past hour, that's exactly how he had felt. He prided himself on being the smartest, most important person in any room, yet this man, this so-called celebrity, had completely unraveled his sense of superiority without saying or doing anything remotely combative. It was maddening. Determined to regain the upper hand, Brian decided to get more information. Leaning toward the elderly woman across the aisle, he lowered his voice. "So, you seem to know a lot about him," he said, his tone casual but probing. "What's the big deal? Why is everyone so obsessed with this guy?" The woman glanced up from her book, her sharp eyes cutting through his feigned politeness. She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to entertain his question. Finally, she set her book down and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with a hint of disdain. Brian frowned. "I mean, I know he's an actor. Big deal. There are hundreds of them. What makes him so special? The woman tilted her head, studying him. You're not really asking because you want to know. You're asking because you want a reason to tear him down. Brian opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand to stop him. Save it. I've seen your type before. Always looking for a weakness, a way to feel superior. Let me save you the trouble, you won't find it here. Her words hit Brian harder than he cared to admit. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms defensively. So, what? He's some kind of saint. Give me a break. The woman shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. He's not a saint. He's human, just like the rest of us. But he's the kind of human we should all aspire to be. Brian snorted. That's a pretty bold statement for someone who's only seen him on a plane. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. Do you want to hear the truth, or are you just here to argue? Brian hesitated. His curiosity, though begrudging, got the better of him. Fine, he said. Enlighten me. The woman settled back in her seat, her gaze distant as she began to speak. About 10 years ago, my granddaughter was diagnosed with leukemia. It was a devastating time for our family. We were drowning in medical bills, and every treatment felt like a gamble. We tried fundraising, but it wasn't enough. I thought we were going to lose her. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure where this was going. One day, out of the blue, we received an anonymous donation, the woman continued. It covered every single bill. At first, we thought it was a mistake, but then the hospital told us it came from a private donor. We never found out who it was, until years later, when my son came across an article about Keanu Reeves quietly helping families in need. The details matched perfectly. Her voice wavered slightly, but her expression remained steady. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want a thank you. He just wanted to help. That's the kind of person he is. Brian stared at her, his skepticism faltering. How do you know it was him? I don't, she admitted. But I've read enough stories about him to know it's not out of character. He's given away millions of dollars to causes he believes in, often without anyone knowing. He's helped his coworkers, his fans, even complete strangers. And he's never once asked for praise. Brian was quiet for a moment, his usual arrogance replaced by a flicker of doubt. But his pride wouldn't let him admit he was wrong, not yet. Okay, so he's generous, he said, shrugging. That doesn't mean he's perfect. No one is perfect, the woman replied. But kindness like his is rare. And the way you've treated him on this flight says more about you than it does about him. Before Brian could respond, a younger man seated a few rows behind them chimed in. She's right, you know, he said, leaning forward. I met Keanu a few years ago at an airport. My flight got cancelled, and I was stuck overnight with no place to stay. He overheard me talking to the airline staff and offered to share his hotel room so I wouldn't have to sleep in the terminal. I didn't even know who he was at the time. He never mentioned his name, just said he wanted to help. The cabin grew quiet as more passengers began to share their stories. I read about how he gave up part of his salary so the special effects team on The Matrix could get paid more, one woman said. Didn't he buy motorcycles for the stunt team on John Wick? Another passenger added. He once spent hours signing autographs for fans after a movie premiere, someone else chimed in. Brian felt a growing sense of unease as the stories piled up, each one painting a picture of a man who was nothing like the Hollywood stereotypes Brian had mocked. Keanu Reeves wasn't just a talented actor, he was a genuinely good person, the kind Brian had spent most of his life dismissing as naive or weak. Across the aisle, Keanu continued to write in his notebook, seemingly oblivious to the conversation. Or perhaps he was aware of it and chose to ignore it, just as he had ignored Brian's earlier insults. For the first time, Brian felt a pang of guilt. He had spent the entire flight trying to tear this man down, only to realize he was the exact opposite of everything Brian had assumed. The elderly woman leaned toward him once more, her voice softer this time. "You asked me why everyone admires him. Now you know. But admiration isn't the point. Respect is. Maybe it's time you learned a little of that." Brian didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words, and the stories he had just heard, left him speechless. The reflection that came too late. The remainder of the flight passed in an uneasy silence for Brian. While the other passengers chatted, shared stories, and occasionally looked over at Keanu, Brian sat back in his seat, his mind racing. His earlier arrogance had dissipated, replaced by a strange mixture of shame and confusion. He stared out the window, unable to shake the image of the man across from him, a man he had spent hours mocking, who, by all accounts, was nothing like the persona Brian had built in his mind. For the first time, Brian found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about success, about fame, and about what really mattered. All of his life, he had chased wealth and status, believing that these things were the only markers of a person's worth. And yet, here was a man who had everything, the fame, the wealth, the talent, but none of the arrogance or entitlement Brian had assumed would come with it. As the plane cruised toward its destination, Brian couldn't help but replay the stories the other passengers had shared. The young man who had been helped by Keanu at the airport. The woman whose family had been saved by an anonymous donation. The countless others who had witnessed his acts of generosity, his kindness, and his humility. Brian had lived a life of competition, of proving himself to be better, smarter, and more successful than everyone around him. He had believed that this was the way to earn respect, through dominance, through showing that he was the best. But now, as he thought about Keanu, he realized how hollow that mindset really was. It wasn't about being the loudest or the richest. It wasn't about how much money you had or how many people feared or admired you. It was about how you treated others, how you used your success to make a positive impact on the world, and how you carried yourself with integrity. It was about kindness, humility, and empathy, things Brian had long overlooked in his pursuit of power. When the plane began its descent, the cabin crew prepared for landing. The tension between Brian and the rest of the passengers had mostly dissipated, but Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The casual, throwaway comments he had made earlier, mocking Keanu's appearance, his lifestyle, his humility, now felt cringe-worthy and out of place. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to put others down in order to feel superior, and yet here he was, questioning everything he thought he knew. Keanu, for his part, had remained unfazed throughout the flight. He had never once responded to Brian's insults or provoked conflict. Instead, he had quietly gone about his own business, offering smiles, kind words, and helping those around him without expecting anything in return. He had shown Brian the kind of strength that wasn't measured in money or status, but in character. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Brian found himself glancing over at Keanu once more. The man was now gathering his things, his movements slow and deliberate, almost meditative. He smiled at the flight attendants as they passed by, thanked the crew for their service, and walked calmly toward the exit, his footsteps steady and unhurried. Brian, still in his seat, couldn't help but watch him go. The man's calm demeanor and unassuming presence made Brian feel small, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't a feeling of defeat, it was more of a humbling realization. He had spent so much of his life chasing after the wrong things. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it would be like to live differently, to find value in the simple things and in the way he treated others. As the rest of the passengers slowly gathered their belongings and began to file out of the plane, Brian remained seated, lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Keanu had been more than just a chance meeting. It had been a wake-up call, a chance for him to re-evaluate his life, his choices, and his values. The elderly woman from earlier caught his eye as she passed him on her way out. She gave him a nod of recognition, and for the first time in hours, Brian smiled back. "Think about it," she said quietly, before disappearing down the aisle. Brian took a deep breath and stood up, slowly making his way to the exit. His mind was still whirling, but there was a new sense of clarity that had settled in. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew he needed to change. He needed to become the kind of person who valued kindness over competition, who saw success not as an accumulation of wealth, but as a measure of how much he could give to others. As he stepped off the plane, the first thing he saw was Keanu, waiting near the gate for a car to pick him up. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Keanu offered him a small, polite nod. Brian nodded back, this time with sincerity. He wasn't sure if Keanu had any idea what kind of effect his presence had on him, but he was determined to carry the lesson he had learned that day with him from now on. It wasn't too late to change. In fact, it was just the beginning. The unlikely friendship. As Brian walked through the airport terminal, his mind was still reeling. The encounter with Keanu had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For most of his life, he had lived in a bubble, isolated from the realities of human kindness and humility. The interactions he had witnessed on that flight, people offering their stories of admiration and gratitude for Keanu, had struck him at his core. What had bothered Brian the most, however, wasn't just how wrong he had been about Keanu, it was the deep sense of loneliness that had begun to creep in. For years, he had relied on his own success to fill the void, thinking that more achievements, more money, would eventually make him happy. But now, as he processed the events of the flight, he realized just how empty that pursuit had been. As he made his way to baggage claim, he spotted a familiar face. It was the elderly woman, standing near the carousel, waiting for her suitcase. She smiled warmly when she saw him, and for a moment, Brian felt a strange sense of gratitude. "Hello again," she said, her voice calm, as always. "Hi," Brian replied, almost sheepishly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about Keanu and about me." She raised an eyebrow, an expression that suggested she already knew what was coming. "I hope you've learned something from it." "I have," Brian admitted, his voice softer than usual. "I spent most of my life chasing the wrong things. I thought being the best, having the most money, that would make me happy. But now I see, it doesn't." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had heard this confession many times before. "It's a hard lesson, isn't it? But one that's worth learning. The real measure of a person isn't what they have, but how they treat others, and how they use their position to make the world better." Brian's thoughts returned to the quiet, unassuming figure of Keanu, who had carried himself with such grace and generosity. He couldn't help but wonder how someone who had so much could remain so grounded and focused on others. It was a rare quality, something Brian had never fully appreciated before. "Do you think," Brian started cautiously, "I could ever be like him?" The woman looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I think you already have it in you. It's just a matter of changing your focus. Start small, with one act of kindness at a time. If you make it a habit, it will become a part of who you are." "I'll try," Brian said quietly, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. As the baggage claim carousel finally started to move, Brian's mind shifted once again, this time focusing on the simple changes he could start making in his life. No longer would he chase hollow achievements or try to prove his worth to anyone. From now on, his goal was to build a life based on kindness, empathy, and humility. Several weeks passed, and Brian began to slowly put his new mindset into practice. It wasn't easy at first. Old habits die hard, after all, and the pull of success, the desire to keep pushing forward, to keep winning, was hard to shake. But each day, he made a conscious effort to engage with people differently. He listened more. He gave compliments without expecting anything in return. He volunteered at local charities and offered to help colleagues with their projects, no strings attached. The results were immediate, though not always what he expected. Some people were skeptical at first, unsure if this new, kinder version of Brian was real. Others were more open to the change, and Brian found that, for the first time in years, he was building meaningful connections, not just superficial ones. But there was one thing that remained constant throughout this journey: Keanu's influence. The quiet strength he had witnessed on the plane stayed with Brian in ways he couldn't explain. Every time he felt the pull to revert to old habits, he thought back to the way Keanu had handled the mockery, the insults, and the relentless curiosity of the people around him. Keanu had never faltered. He had never engaged in the drama or tried to defend himself. Instead, he had chosen kindness, simplicity, and humility. In many ways, Keanu had unknowingly become Brian's role model, a man who, despite all the fame and fortune, lived in a way that most people only dreamed of. Keanu's quiet acts of generosity and selflessness had inspired Brian to take a hard look at his own life and decide that he wanted to change for the better. One evening, a few months later, Brian found himself at a charity event for underprivileged children. He had been invited to attend as a guest, having recently taken on a more active role in local community outreach. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and making small talk, he couldn't help but notice a familiar face in the corner of the room. It was Keanu. The man was standing near a table, talking with a group of young volunteers. He was dressed casually, as always, but there was something about him that radiated peace and warmth. Keanu noticed Brian standing in the distance and, to Brian's surprise, smiled and waved him over. "Hey there," Keanu said, extending his hand as Brian approached. "It's good to see you again." Brian hesitated for a moment, the memories of their encounter on the plane flooding back. But then, he took a deep breath and extended his hand. "It's good to see you too," he replied, his voice sincere. Keanu chuckled lightly. "I've been hearing some good things about you. It sounds like you're making a real difference in the community." Brian felt a flush of pride, but it wasn't the kind he had felt before. This wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about the feeling of knowing that he was finally on the right path. "I'm trying," Brian said, his voice steady. "I've learned a lot since we met. About what really matters, about how to live my life with more purpose." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood exactly what Brian was talking about. "That's all any of us can do, really. Just try to make the world a little better, one step at a time." Brian smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude toward this man who had unknowingly set him on a new path. He wasn't sure if Keanu would ever fully understand the impact he had on him, but in that moment, Brian realized something important: it wasn't necessary for Keanu to know. What mattered was that Brian had learned. And in that quiet, humble moment, Brian understood the power of kindness, of being the kind of person who could change lives without even trying. As he walked away from Keanu, he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. This was just the beginning of his journey, but for the first time in years, Brian was certain he was heading in the right direction. The ripple effect of change. The weeks following that charity event became a period of profound growth for Brian. Though the journey was not without its challenges, each day brought new lessons, both in the small acts of kindness he performed and in the larger transformations within himself. Brian had made a promise to himself that he would continue to walk this path of change, not for the recognition or accolades, but because it felt right, because it gave him a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. As he continued to give, Brian began to see how his actions affected those around him. A kind word here, an offer of help there, it was as though the world had been waiting for him to change. The people in his life began to reflect that change, treating him with respect, trust, and even gratitude. His colleagues, once wary of his competitiveness and drive for dominance, now began to approach him for advice, not because of his wealth or status, but because they had come to see his sincerity. One day, as Brian was volunteering at a local animal shelter, a place he had recently become deeply involved with, he ran into an old friend, Jack. Jack had been a part of Brian's social circle for years, but their friendship had always been one of convenience, more about status than real connection. Jack was a businessman, constantly pushing for the next deal, the next opportunity. He had always admired Brian for his ambition but never understood his recent shift in priorities. "Brian, my man," Jack said, clapping him on the back as he approached. "I didn't expect to find you here. This place doesn't exactly scream high society, does it?" Brian smiled, but the comment stung a little. "It's not about high society, Jack. It's about doing something that matters." Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Right. But come on, you used to be all about the money, the success, the parties. What's changed?" "I mean, I get the whole, do good for the community, thing, but you? This isn't you." Brian could sense the judgment in Jack's tone, but he wasn't bothered by it anymore. He had spent too long caring about what others thought, trying to live up to their expectations. Now, he knew who he was, and he didn't need Jack's approval to be proud of the changes he had made. "I guess I'm just trying to make a difference, in whatever way I can," Brian said quietly, his voice steady. "I've been focusing a lot on giving back lately. I don't need to have it all to feel fulfilled. I'm starting to realize that the real wealth is in the connections we make, the lives we touch." Jack paused, looking Brian up and down as though he were seeing him for the first time. Then, after a long moment, he shrugged. "I don't know, man. It just doesn't sound like you. But hey, if it works for you." Brian nodded. "It does work for me. More than anything else ever has." That was the moment when Brian realized that not everyone would understand. Not everyone would support his change, and that was okay. Change, after all, was not about pleasing others, it was about finding peace with oneself. As time passed, Brian's efforts in the community began to pay off in ways he hadn't expected. He was invited to speak at charity events, not because of his wealth, but because of his newfound focus on empathy and kindness. He began to mentor young professionals, helping them navigate their careers without falling into the same traps he had once succumbed to. And it was during one of these events that Brian received an unexpected message, one that would change the course of his journey once again. The message was from an old friend of Keanu's, someone Brian had never met but had heard stories about. The email was brief, but it was enough to spark something inside him. Keanu had heard about the work Brian was doing in the community, his efforts to help others, his transformation from the self-centered businessman he once was to the man he had become. Keanu wanted to meet him again. Keanu had seen Brian's growth, and he was curious to hear more about his journey. It seemed that, despite all the fame and the hustle of Hollywood, Keanu had noticed something extraordinary in Brian, a shift, a spark of change. Brian couldn't believe it. The man who had unknowingly inspired him to become a better person was now acknowledging that very change. For a moment, he felt like he was in a dream. He quickly agreed to meet Keanu, eager to share his story and to express his gratitude for the impact Keanu had made on his life. When the day of the meeting arrived, Brian felt a nervous excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He arrived at the coffee shop early, pacing outside until he spotted Keanu walking toward him. The actor looked as relaxed and humble as ever, his jeans and hoodie a stark contrast to the high-profile lifestyle Brian had once imagined him leading. Keanu's smile was warm as he approached. "Hey, Brian. Good to see you." "Good to see you too," Brian replied, offering a handshake that Keanu accepted with a smile. They sat down at a quiet table, and for the first time, Brian had the chance to speak openly with the man who had unknowingly set him on his current path. As they exchanged stories, Brian couldn't help but marvel at Keanu's humility. He had lived through so much, success, loss, fame, and hardship, and yet, he had maintained an unwavering commitment to kindness and generosity. "I'm grateful for what you've done, Keanu," Brian said sincerely. "You changed my life. Your example has inspired me in ways I can't even describe. It's because of you that I started giving back, that I realized there's more to life than just money and status." Keanu shrugged modestly, as if the idea of being someone's hero was foreign to him. "I just do what I can, man. We all have something to offer, even if we don't realize it. It's all about making a difference, no matter how small." Brian nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "You've done more than that, Keanu. You've shown me what it means to be a truly good person." Keanu smiled again, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that. But remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying to be the best version of yourself, one day at a time." As they continued to talk, Brian realized that this meeting wasn't just a recognition of his growth, it was a new chapter in their connection. For the first time, he felt like he was truly aligned with his values, no longer living for the applause or the praise but for the quiet moments of fulfillment that came from living with integrity. The ripple effect of Brian's change continued to spread. From his local community outreach to his deeper connections with friends and colleagues, it became clear that kindness could indeed change the world, one person at a time. And as Brian looked at Keanu, sitting across from him, he knew that the man's impact had been far greater than either of them could fully comprehend. A life rewritten. As the months passed, Brian's life became something he never could have imagined in his previous world of high-rise offices and expensive cars. He had let go of the persona that had once driven him, always competing, always striving for more, and replaced it with something that felt infinitely more rewarding. His days were now filled with purpose, a purpose that had little to do with wealth and everything to do with human connection. One of the things that surprised Brian most about this change was how easily others began to follow his example. At first, he had wondered if his transformation would be a solitary journey, if the people around him would be resistant or dismissive of his new outlook on life. But the opposite happened. As Brian began to open up, to share his story of change, his friends, colleagues, and even strangers began to reflect his values. Acts of kindness were becoming more common, both large and small. People smiled at each other more often, offered help when it wasn't expected, and started viewing their work not just as a means of income but as a way to make a positive impact on the world. The ripple effect was more powerful than Brian had ever anticipated. It wasn't long before Brian's work with charity organizations expanded. He had been invited to speak at conferences on kindness, human connection, and the power of community, and his story was inspiring others in ways he had never thought possible. He found himself traveling the world, attending events where people shared their own acts of generosity in ways they were helping those in need. Brian had become a messenger, a living example of what could happen when someone opened their heart and let go of their need to be the best. Through all of this, one constant remained: Keanu. The quiet man who had unknowingly changed Brian's life continued to inspire him in ways words couldn't capture. Brian had learned so much from Keanu, not just about kindness, but about the power of humility in staying grounded, no matter what success came your way. Keanu had always chosen to put others first, and it was that choice that Brian had come to admire more than anything else. One evening, after a particularly moving speech he had delivered at a charity gala, Brian received a phone call. He recognized the number instantly. It was Keanu. "Hey, Brian," Keanu's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "How's everything going?" Brian smiled as he picked up the phone. "Hey, Keanu. It's going well. Really well. I'm actually heading back from a speaking engagement right now." "I heard," Keanu replied, his tone light. "You're really making a difference out there. It's incredible to see how far you've come." "I couldn't have done it without you," Brian said, his voice full of gratitude. "You're the reason I'm here. You're the reason I found my purpose." Keanu's laugh was soft, humble. "I don't think I did anything special, man. You did all the hard work. I just opened a door." "Well, that door changed everything for me," Brian said sincerely. "And now, it's not just me. I see the change in the people around me too. People are starting to wake up to what really matters. It's like a wave that's spreading, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. Keanu paused for a moment, as if reflecting on Brian's words. You're living proof that one person can make a difference, Brian. And that's the power we all have, even if we don't see it right away. Keep doing what you're doing. You're changing the world, one step at a time. Brian felt a lump form in his throat as he spoke. I'll keep going, Keanu. I'll keep going because it's the only thing that feels right. As Brian hung up the phone, a sense of peace washed over him. His life had been transformed, and yet, he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. This was only the beginning. It wasn't about being famous. It wasn't about being the richest, the most powerful, or the most admired. It was about using whatever platform you had to make a positive impact, to lift others up, and to show the world that kindness was still the most powerful currency of all. As Brian reflected on his journey, he realized that everything had come full circle. The man he had mocked on that fateful flight had become the catalyst for the most profound transformation of his life. Keanu had never asked for recognition, never sought the spotlight. He had simply lived his truth, and in doing so, he had inspired countless others to do the same. Brian thought about how far he had come, how he had gone from a self-centered businessman to a man who truly understood the value of love, compassion, and the importance of making the world a better place. He had changed. And in doing so, he had helped others change too. The ripple effect was real, and Brian knew that it was only going to grow stronger. Each act of kindness, each moment of empathy, would continue to create waves that would spread far beyond what he could see. It wasn't just a story about Keanu or about Brian, it was a story about the power we all hold to change the world. As Brian walked away from the gala that night, his heart was full. The lessons he had learned, the people he had met, and the way his life had unfolded felt more meaningful than anything he had ever experienced before. For the first time, he was living authentically, doing what he loved, being the person he had always wanted to be, and giving back to a world that had given him so much. And as he stepped into the future, Brian knew that his story was just one small part of a much bigger picture, a picture of hope, of resilience, and of the power of human connection. This was the life he had always been meant to live.